The sun had barely risen over the quiet suburbs of Los Angeles when Bishop Robert Barron arrived early at the Word on Fire headquarters. The building was still cloaked in morning silence, its halls dimly lit and empty. As he walked through the corridors with a steaming cup of black coffee in hand, he passed by the office of one of his employees, a young man named Thomas, a quiet editor who mostly kept to himself. Thomas had always been punctual, if not early, but that morning his office was dark, his chair empty, and his computer screen blank. Bishop Barron paused. It wasn't like Thomas to be late, especially on a Wednesday, the busiest editing day of the week. A strange knot formed in his stomach. Something didn't feel right. Later that afternoon, Thomas still hadn't shown up. No email, no call, no text. His phone went straight to voicemail. As the hours passed, Bishop Barron found it increasingly difficult to focus on his meetings and sermon preparations. There was something in his conscience tugging at him, a quiet but persistent voice that whispered, "Follow him. Something's not right." That evening, after staff had gone home and the offices dimmed once again, Bishop Barron sat alone in his chair, rereading the last project Thomas had worked on, a documentary about redemption and human suffering. In it, Thomas had edited a scene with extraordinary sensitivity, piecing together testimonies of people who had gone through incredible hardship. His empathy was all over the film, as if he himself understood pain on a deeper level than he let on. "Why do I feel like I've been missing something?" the bishop whispered to himself. Driven by an unshakable conviction, he decided to do something uncharacteristic for a man of his status. He picked up his coat, grabbed his car keys, and drove toward the address listed in Thomas's employee file. It was a modest neighborhood, nestled between the older parts of the city, an area that had seen better days. The houses were worn down, some with broken fences, others with faded paint peeling off like dried parchment. Bishop Barron parked a few blocks away, uncertain of how to proceed. He didn't want to appear intrusive or invasive. He just needed to know Thomas was all right. But as he walked closer, he noticed something, or someone, in the shadows near a street corner. A thin figure sat on a bench under a flickering lamppost, hunched over, hoodie up, arms wrapped around his knees. It was Thomas. He looked nothing like the composed, buttoned-up editor who worked diligently behind his screen. His clothes were wrinkled and old, his shoes scuffed and torn. His face, partially hidden beneath the hood, showed signs of fatigue and something far deeper: despair. Bishop Barron approached slowly, his voice soft but firm. "Thomas?" The young man flinched, startled, then slowly turned to face him. His eyes were red, not from tears, but from exhaustion. And something else the bishop recognized instantly: shame. "Bishop!" Thomas's voice cracked. What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing." Thomas looked away. "I didn't mean for anyone to see me here. Why didn't you come to work today?" I couldn't." "Why not?" There was a long pause. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, Thomas exhaled shakily and muttered, "Because this is where I sleep now." Bishop Barron felt a sharp stab in his heart. "What do you mean?" "I've been homeless for 3 weeks, Thomas said, avoiding eye contact. "I've been trying to hide it. I didn't want anyone to know. I sleep on this bench, sometimes in the back of an abandoned building a few blocks down. I go to the gym in the morning to shower, and I show up to work like everything's fine." The bishop was silent, not out of judgment, but because he was fighting to keep his composure. He'd seen suffering in many forms during his ministry, but never so close to home. Never from someone under his own roof, in his own ministry. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because I was ashamed," Thomas said, his voice trembling now. "I didn't want to be a burden. I thought if I could just get through a few more weeks, maybe something would change. I didn't want people to see me like this. I didn't want you to see me like this." Bishop Barron sat beside him on the bench, the cold of the metal pressing through his coat. He looked at Thomas not with pity, but with profound compassion. "You are not a burden," he said gently. "You are a child of God, and whatever led you to this moment, we're going to walk through it together." Thomas broke down. The weight he'd carried in silence for weeks, perhaps months, poured out in the form of tears and choked sobs. Bishop Barron didn't rush him. He placed a hand on his shoulder and sat with him in the stillness. letting the young man grieve what he'd been forced to endure alone. That night changed everything. It was just the beginning, but a beginning forged in raw truth and a grace that neither of them would forget. The following morning, Bishop Barron sat in his private office, the weight of the previous night pressing on him like a heavy cloak. The early light filtered through the stained glass window, casting colorful fragments across the room, but none of them seemed to touch his heart. His mind replayed the image of Thomas, hunched on that bench, trying to hold together a life silently falling apart. He had insisted Thomas come home with him that night. At first, Thomas resisted, saying he didn't want to impose, but the bishop had been firm, not out of pity, but out of duty. A shepherd could not leave his sheep in the cold. And so Thomas had slept in the guest room of the bishop's modest residence, finally under a roof again. Now Bishop Barron stared at the phone on his desk. He didn't know exactly what to do next, but he knew he had to start somewhere. He reached out to a few trusted contacts at local shelters, not to expose Thomas, but to learn more, to understand how this could have happened under his very nose. The more he discovered, the more his heart broke. Thomas had grown up in foster care, bouncing from home to home. Despite the instability, he had managed to graduate with honors, put himself through college, and land the editing job at Word on Fire. But 6 months ago, his mother, a woman he hadn't seen in years, had suddenly died. Though estranged, her death opened a wound he hadn't even realized was still bleeding. Thomas fell behind on rent. He couldn't focus at work. Eventually, he was evicted quietly and began living out of his car. When that was towed due to unpaid tickets, he was left with nothing but a backpack and a street corner. And yet, he kept showing up to work, smiling, producing quality content, hiding his pain behind headphones and a glowing monitor. That afternoon, Thomas sat in the kitchen of the bishop's home, holding a steaming mug of tea in both hands. He looked better after a shower and a good meal, but his eyes still held shadows. "I'm sorry," he said again. "You have nothing to apologize for," the bishop replied, setting down a small plate of toast. "I'm the one who should be sorry. I've always prided myself on being attentive to people's needs, but I didn't see yours. And you had no reason to suspect. That's the problem," Bishop Barron said, lowering his voice. "There are too many people we have no reason to suspect, because they've learned to suffer silently." Thomas stared at the tea. "Sometimes I'd come to work hoping someone would notice, not because I wanted help, but because I just wanted to be seen." The bishop sat down across from him, folding his hands on the table. "Well, I see you now. And more importantly, God sees you." A quiet tear slipped down Thomas's cheek. Over the next few days, Bishop Barron went about his ministry as usual, but something inside him had shifted. He began to speak differently in his sermons, less about abstract theology and more about the hidden pain that dwells in everyday people. He spoke of dignity, of quiet suffering, of the sacred responsibility we have to truly see one another. People noticed. Congregants who had grown used to his polished homilies now found themselves leaning forward in the pews, drawn by the raw honesty in his voice. One Sunday, he even shared part of Thomas's story, not naming him, but describing a young man who had worked in ministry while sleeping on a bench. The silence that followed was thick with realization. After Mass, a woman approached him. She was in her 70s, wearing a simple shawl and faded shoes. She took the bishop's hand and whispered, "My grandson. He's on the street too. I didn't know how to talk about it until now." One story had begun to break open many others. Meanwhile, Thomas stayed at the bishop's home, slowly regaining his footing. But he struggled with the idea of staying indefinitely. "I can't keep living off your kindness," he said one evening. "You're not," Bishop Barron replied. "You're living off God's mercy. I'm just the instrument." Still, Thomas wanted to find his own path forward. So the bishop helped him connect with a local Catholic organization that offered housing and job placement for people in crisis. But when Thomas went in for the first meeting, something unexpected happened. Instead of asking for help, he offered it. "I know how to edit video," he told them. "I know how to tell stories. Maybe I can help share the stories of the people you serve." The director was moved. Within 2 weeks, Thomas was helping film interviews with men and women who had once been where he was, sleeping in alleyways, abandoned buildings, or shelters. He listened to their pain, not as an outsider, but as a brother, and the camera became his instrument of healing. One of the first videos he edited was shown at a fundraiser for the shelter. It featured a former addict who had found new life through the community's programs. The video ended with a close-up of the man's weathered hands folded in prayer. The room was silent. Then someone stood and clapped. Then another, and another. By the end of the night, they had raised more money than any previous fundraiser. Back at home, Bishop Barron watched the video and felt tears sting the corners of his eyes. "You're not just editing stories," he told Thomas. "You're bearing witness to resurrection." Word about Thomas's journey began to quietly spread among the inner circles of Word on Fire. Some staff members had known him only through emails and brief meetings, but now they were learning about the depth of his struggle and his strength. Far from pity, they felt awe, and something deeper was beginning to stir in them as well. Reflection. Bishop Barron noticed it first in their meetings. People listened more intently. They spoke with more humility. They asked questions with a new tone, one laced not just with curiosity, but care. The workplace had begun to change. The culture had softened, deepened. One afternoon, a young intern named Lily approached the bishop after a weekly staff gathering. "Bishop," she said nervously, "I just want to say thank you for what you did for Thomas. It gave me the courage to tell my parents about my depression. I've been hiding it for a long time." He looked at her with tenderness. "I'm so glad you spoke up. You don't have to carry this alone." That single act of following an employee in silence had rippled through lives in ways he never anticipated. But the impact wasn't limited to Word on Fire. Thomas's new video work for the shelter was being shared on social media. Churches began inviting him to speak, not from a pulpit, but from the heart. His testimony, humble and honest, resonated with people across generations. And Bishop Barron, seeing this transformation, began thinking about all the other Thomases out there. Those within the church, hidden in pews or behind ministry desks, who carried pain in silence. He felt the Holy Spirit calling him towards something more. One night, while Thomas was editing in the kitchen, Bishop Barron entered with a large binder filled with notes. "I've been thinking about starting something new," he said. Thomas looked up. "What is it?" "A new initiative, something beyond Word on Fire. I want to create a program for church leaders to learn how to recognize hidden suffering. Not just theology, empathy, real pastoral presence." Thomas's brow furrowed. "Like training?" "Training, retreats, seminars, even digital resources. But at its heart, it's about teaching clergy and lay leaders how to see, how to listen, how to notice the person sleeping on the bench right outside their parish." Thomas nodded slowly, then smiled. "That sounds like something that could save lives." The bishop returned the smile. "It already has." In the months that followed, they began drafting the framework for the initiative. They called it the Ministry of Presence. The idea was simple but powerful: to equip the church with tools to become more human, more attentive, more like Christ in the quiet moments of encounter. The first retreat was held at a retreat house just outside Chicago. They invited 30 pastors and lay leaders from across the country. Thomas came too, not as a participant, but as a speaker. When he stood in front of the small crowd to share his story, he was nervous. But as he began to speak, the room fell into a sacred hush. He didn't dramatize, he didn't embellish, he simply told the truth. "I was working in a Catholic ministry while sleeping on the streets," he said, "and no one noticed. Not because they didn't care, but because I got really good at hiding. We all do, especially in church." He paused, scanning the faces before him. "I didn't need a savior in that moment. I needed someone to sit next to me on the bench and say, 'I see you.' That's what the bishop did. And it changed everything." One priest in the back wiped his eyes. Another woman placed her hand over her heart. After the session, people lined up just to thank him. Some shared their own hidden wounds. Others confessed how often they'd missed the pain in their own communities. A deacon pulled him aside and whispered, "You just gave me permission to stop pretending I have it all together." Back in Los Angeles, the initiative continued to grow. Bishop Barron began incorporating these themes into his public talks and YouTube messages. He spoke of empathy as theology, of mercy as liturgy, of presence as sacrament. The emails poured in. One came from a woman in Michigan. "I watched your video and realized I hadn't looked my teenage son in the eye for weeks. Tonight we sat and talked for 2 hours." Another came from a retired pastor in Texas. "I always thought I had to preach louder to be heard, but I learned from your message that sometimes silence and presence are the loudest sermons." Thomas, for his part, continued to live simply. He declined offers for speaking tours and book deals. He preferred to stay behind the scenes, filming others, editing stories of recovery and grace. But he never forgot the bench. It remained etched in his memory, not as a symbol of failure, but of turning. One rainy evening, he returned to that corner, the place where Bishop Barron had found him. The bench was still there, slick with rain, but it no longer carried the same weight. Now, it was sacred ground. He sat for a moment, pulled out his phone, and snapped a picture. Later, he printed that photo and framed it. He gave it to the bishop with a note taped on the back. "Thank you for sitting with me in the storm." The bishop placed the photo on his desk. Every morning he looked at it before writing, praying, or planning. It reminded him that sometimes the most powerful ministry begins not in a cathedral or a lecture hall, but on a broken bench under a flickering street lamp. Months passed, and the ministry of presence began to gain recognition beyond the church. Mental health organizations, universities, and even secular leadership programs reached out, intrigued by this movement of radical attentiveness. Bishop Barron was invited to speak at places he never imagined, like a psychology symposium at Stanford and a leadership forum hosted by a Fortune 500 company. But he never lost sight of where it all began. Every time he mentioned the movement, he credited a young man named Thomas, whose silence taught me to listen. At first, Thomas was reluctant to be mentioned at all. He didn't want to be seen as a mascot for suffering. But when he saw the impact his story had on others, he began to accept it, not as a burden, but as a gift. The suffering had not defined him. The healing had. One evening, Bishop Barron and Thomas sat on the back porch of the bishop's home. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting gold across the sky. They were eating a simple dinner, grilled vegetables and rice, while the cicadas buzzed softly in the background. "I still think about that night," Thomas said suddenly. "The bench?" Thomas nodded. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't followed me." The bishop looked down for a moment. "I think about it too. Not because I need to be reminded of what I did, but because I need to remember how close I came to not doing it. I almost stayed in my office that night." Thomas smiled faintly. "But you didn't." "No," the bishop replied. "God didn't let me." There was a pause, filled only by the distant sound of wind through the trees. "Do you ever feel guilty?" Thomas asked quietly. The bishop looked at him with gentle eyes. "For not noticing sooner?" Thomas nodded. "Every day," the bishop said honestly. "But I turned that guilt into prayer, into awareness, into action." Thomas leaned back in his chair, letting the words settle. "I think, if we all paid attention the way you did that night, the world would be a different place." Bishop Barron didn't answer. He simply reached for his rosary and began to pray silently, his lips barely moving, fingers sliding across the beads. Thomas watched him for a moment, then pulled out his phone. "Mind if I record this?" "It's beautiful." The bishop nodded. That short, unplanned clip, just a minute of silent prayer against the backdrop of crickets and fading sunlight, would go on to touch millions when Thomas uploaded it under the title, "The Peace of Presence." It became a meditation for people in recovery, a comfort for those grieving, and a reminder for leaders across the globe that sometimes the best thing you can offer is simply to be there. But not everyone was comfortable with the bishop's new direction. Some critics argued that his focus on emotional suffering detracted from traditional doctrine. Others questioned his close relationship with Thomas, accusing him of favoritism or blurred boundaries. One letter arrived at the diocesan office, unsigned but scathing. "You've let your emotions compromise your authority," it read. "A bishop should lead from strength, not sentiment." Bishop Barron read the letter twice, folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. He didn't respond. Instead, he walked down the hall to where Thomas was editing a new video and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for helping me lead differently," he said. Thomas didn't know what the bishop had read, but he smiled anyway. The attacks didn't stop the movement. If anything, they made it stronger. People began writing in from prisons, hospitals, schools. A chaplain from the military sent an email thanking the bishop for reminding us that strength and tenderness are not opposites. And then came the call that would change everything again. It was from a small parish in upstate New York. The priest there had heard about the ministry of presence and invited Bishop Barron to come speak during their Lenten mission. It was a humble parish, struggling financially, but they had a unique request. "We want to make this retreat free for the homeless and the brokenhearted." The bishop was moved. He accepted the invitation immediately, and when he asked Thomas to join him, the young man agreed. They arrived in March. The wind was cold, the snow still fresh on the ground, but the welcome was warm. The church was modest, its pews worn from decades of use, but the spirit inside was alive. That first night, Thomas stood before an audience of about 50 people, half of whom had no permanent address. Some came from shelters, others from the street. A few still smelled of smoke and hardship. But they listened. Every word, every pause. "I don't have answers," Thomas said, "but I have a story, and maybe that's enough for tonight." When he finished, there was no applause, just silence, reverent, aching silence. Then a man in the back raised his hand. His face was weathered, his coat too big for his frame. "Do you think God still sees us?" Thomas looked directly at him and answered with a voice both trembling and certain, "I think he never stopped." That night, as they walked back to the rectory, Bishop Barron turned to Thomas. "You were born for this." Thomas shook his head humbly. "I was broken for this." And the bishop, with a tear in his eye, whispered, "Then thank God for broken things, because they let the light in." Back in Los Angeles, the rhythm of their daily lives resumed. But something inside both of them had changed after the retreat in New York. The raw honesty of those who attended, the deep hunger for being seen and heard, had left an indelible mark. Thomas spent the next several weeks piecing together footage from the trip, transforming it into a short film titled, "What God Still Sees." When Bishop Barron watched the final cut for the first time, he didn't speak for several minutes afterward. The screen had gone dark, but the silence lingered between them. "This isn't just a video," he finally said. "It's a call." The film was released online and went viral in a matter of days. People from all over the world shared it. Pastors, therapists, teachers, social workers, parents. The comment section exploded with messages. "I saw my brother in this. I work at a shelter and have never felt more understood. Thank you for reminding me I'm not invisible." But not all the attention was positive. A large religious publication published a critical article questioning the direction Bishop Barron was taking with his ministry. They accused him of leaning too far into emotion, of straying from intellectual rigor, and of creating a culture of soft Christianity. Bishop Barron read the article late one night. He set it aside quietly, then stepped outside into the cool air. The stars were faint, the city lights drowning out most of the sky, but one or two still shone through. He thought of the man in the pews in New York, asking if God still saw him. He thought of Thomas, once silent on a bench, now giving voice to the voiceless. He thought of Christ, who didn't preach from a throne, but from dusty roads and dinner tables and crosses. And he whispered aloud to the night, "If this is soft, then let me be soft forever." Inside, Thomas was still working, headphones on, editing another piece. The bishop stood in the doorway, watching the glow of the screen reflect off his face. There was a peace there now. Not perfection, but peace. And that, the bishop had come to realize, was the true fruit of grace. Weeks later, they received an invitation from a maximum security prison in Northern California. A group of inmates had been shown What God Still Sees by the prison chaplain, and they were moved beyond words. They wanted to host a night of reflection and had asked if Bishop Barron and Thomas would come. Security clearance took time, but it was granted. And on a gray, overcast afternoon, they were escorted through layers of gates and checkpoints until they entered a large, cold chapel, surrounded by barbed wire. 30 men sat waiting. All of them wore the same uniforms. Some were young, Others carried decades in their faces. There were tattoos, scars, and eyes that had seen things no one should ever have to see. But when Bishop Barron stepped forward, he didn't see criminals. He saw stories, wounds, souls. "I don't come here to preach at you," he began. "I come here to sit with you, just like I once sat with a young man on a bench." He looked at Thomas. "And I've learned that presence can heal what punishment never could." Thomas followed. He was nervous, unsure of how his words would land. But the moment he began to speak, the room changed. "I once thought suffering meant I was disqualified from doing good," he said. "But I've learned that our deepest wounds are often the very places God wants to speak through." One inmate, a tall man named Elijah, raised his hand. "How do you forgive yourself?" he asked. Thomas looked at him with quiet seriousness. "You don't do it all at once," he said. "You do it one moment at a time. And sometimes you borrow God's forgiveness until you can feel it for yourself." That answer stayed with Elijah. He later told the prison chaplain it was the first time in 10 years he had cried. After the session, the men approached them individually. They shook hands, asked questions, shared parts of their stories. Some gave them drawings they'd made, prayers they'd written. One man handed Thomas a folded note. Later in the car, Thomas opened it. Inside was a single sentence: "You made me feel human again." He stared at it for a long time. Bishop Barron didn't say a word. He didn't need to. That night, they sat in silence at a small diner near the prison, drinking lukewarm coffee and sharing a plate of fries. The exhaustion was real, but so was the fulfillment. Thomas finally spoke. "Sometimes I think, none of this would have happened if I hadn't fallen apart." Bishop Barron nodded. "Sometimes falling apart is the only way God can get through the cracks." They clinked their coffee mugs gently, a quiet toast to grace, to presence, and to a journey neither of them had expected, but both now knew had been divinely orchestrated from the start. The following week, Thomas sat alone in the chapel at Word on Fire. The lights were dim, the air still, and sunlight trickled through stained glass panels, coloring the floor with hues of red and blue. He sat in the back pew, hands folded, breathing slowly. It was the first time in months he had come there without a camera, without a purpose, without anything to do except sit in God's presence. He didn't pray with words. He didn't need to. His silence was prayer enough. Bishop Barron entered quietly and saw him there. He didn't disturb him, didn't walk over, just watched from a distance. It reminded him of that first night on the bench. Thomas wrapped in silence, but different now. Then it was a silence of despair. Now it was reverent. Later that afternoon, Bishop Barron called a staff meeting. Everyone gathered in the large conference room. There was a palpable sense of anticipation. People knew something important was coming. "I want to share something with you all," the bishop began. "A vision I've had for where we go next, not just as a media ministry, but as a family." He clicked the remote, and the screen behind him lit up with the words, "The Invisible Among Us." "It's a new docuseries," he continued. "But more than that, it's a movement. We'll travel across the country and tell stories of the unseen. Those who've suffered silently in our communities, our parishes, our shelters, our prisons. We'll listen, learn, and share what we hear." He turned to Thomas, who stood quietly at the side of the room. "Thomas will lead the project." The room broke into quiet applause, not because Thomas was popular, but because everyone had seen the transformation. They'd witnessed the grace that flowed through him, and they believed in his gift. Thomas stepped forward, his voice steady. "This isn't about shining a light on pain," he said. "It's about illuminating the strength people carry even in the darkest places. It's about showing that presence, genuine, patient presence, can restore dignity." The team began making plans, schedules, locations, contacts, but underneath the logistics was something deeper: purpose. Everyone felt it. They weren't just creating content, they were becoming instruments of grace. The first episode took them to a nursing home in rural Kansas. There they met Gloria, a 92-year-old widow who hadn't had a visitor in over 3 years. Her memory was fading, but her eyes lit up when Thomas asked to hear her story. "I used to sing in the church choir," she said, her voice brittle but warm. "My husband played the organ. We never missed a Sunday." She paused. "Now, sometimes I wonder if God remembers I'm still here." When the episode aired, a flood of letters arrived at the nursing home. People wrote to Gloria from all over the country. Some sent drawings, others poems. One little girl sent a recording of herself singing one of the hymns Gloria used to love. The nursing home director called Bishop Barron in tears. "You've given these people their names back," she said. "You've given them back their presence." Next, they traveled to a rural town in Louisiana to interview a former addict named Marcus, who now ran a recovery center from the basement of a church. His story was raw, filled with regret and redemption. "I lost everything," he said to the camera. "My wife, my kids, even my sense of worth. But one day this priest came into the jail and just sat with me. Didn't preach, didn't scold, just listened. That was the first time I felt human in years." The bishop asked him what had kept him going through the worst moments. Marcus answered without hesitation, "The thought that someone might still believe in me." Thomas didn't say anything in that moment, but later, as they packed up the equipment, he looked at Bishop Barron and whispered, "That used to be me." The bishop nodded. "I know." Word spread fast about the docuseries. Local parishes began hosting viewing nights. Universities invited Thomas and the bishop to speak about the project. Viewers from all backgrounds, religious, agnostic, broken, whole, found something they recognized in the stories. The project was succeeding beyond anything they imagined. But success wasn't what either of them cared about. What mattered most was this: people were being seen. Late one night, after returning from a shoot in Detroit, Thomas sat at his desk reviewing footage. He was exhausted. The past few days had been emotionally draining. He had interviewed a teenage girl who had lost both parents and now volunteered at a food pantry after school. Her strength was overwhelming. "I want to help people not feel alone," she had said. Thomas stared at her face frozen on the screen. Then he leaned back in his chair and covered his face with his hands. The weight of it all, the pain, the hope, the stories, it was a lot. That's when Bishop Barron walked in, holding 2 mugs of chamomile tea. "You okay?" Thomas nodded, voice muffled. "Just full." The bishop sat beside him. They didn't speak for a while. They just sipped their tea and watched the city lights blink outside the window. After a few minutes, Thomas looked over. "Did you ever think one quiet night on a bench would lead to this?" Bishop Barron smiled. "No, but I've learned something since then." "What's that?" "God doesn't need a spotlight to begin a miracle. Sometimes he just needs someone to follow a whisper." In the months that followed, The Invisible Among Us continued to grow, not just as a series, but as a mission that transcended platforms. More than ever, Thomas found himself navigating a strange duality. He was both the quiet observer behind the camera and the living proof of what presence could do. The stories they captured ranged from heartbreaking to hopeful. A blind immigrant mother who raised 4 children while working 3 jobs. A veteran who had been living in his truck until a stranger offered him a shower and a sandwich. A young seminarian who had once been trafficked and found healing through the Eucharist. But one story would come to mark a turning point for Thomas in ways he didn't expect. They were in Chicago, preparing to film at a community center that served teens impacted by gang violence. As they set up their gear, a staff member approached Thomas and handed him a file. "There's someone you should meet," she said. "But this one's delicate." The folder contained a short biography and a photo. Thomas froze. The face staring back at him was that of his younger brother, Daniel. He hadn't seen him in nearly 8 years. They'd been separated in the foster system after their mother lost custody. At first they stayed in touch. Letters, birthday calls, a few meetups when their homes weren't too far apart. But over time, the chaos of survival took over. The calls stopped. The letters dried up. Thomas always feared the worst. Now, here he was, in the same city, in the same building. "He's on his way here now," the staff member said gently. Thomas stepped outside, heart pounding, hands trembling. The cold Chicago air hit his face like ice, but he barely felt it. He didn't know what to expect. Would Daniel recognize him, hate him, blame him? Then, from across the street, a young man approached. Hoodie up, hands in pockets, gait unsure. He stopped at the curb, staring at Thomas. Neither moved. Finally, Thomas took a step forward. "Daniel?" The young man's eyes widened. He dropped his gaze, then looked back. "Tommy?" It was a name Thomas hadn't heard in nearly a decade. They embraced, awkwardly, tightly, as if trying to make up for all the lost time with one gesture. Thomas could feel his brother's ribs beneath his jacket. He was thinner than he remembered. Older. Tired. They sat together inside the community center, side by side, shoulders barely touching. "What happened to you?" Daniel asked first. Thomas laughed softly. "A bench, a bishop, a lot of grace." Daniel chuckled, though his eyes were wet. "You always did know how to make pain sound poetic." "And you?" Thomas asked. Daniel shrugged. "Juvie, then jail, then this place. It's the first place that didn't ask what I did, just asked who I wanted to become." Thomas nodded. "Sounds familiar." Daniel looked at him seriously. "You think there's still a place for me?" Thomas turned and stared at him. "There's always a place." The bishop later joined them and sat quietly as the brothers spoke. He didn't interrupt, didn't advise. He just listened. It reminded Thomas of that first night again. It always came back to presence. Over the following weeks, Daniel became part of the production crew. At first, he just carried equipment and held boom mics. But he was curious, quick to learn. Before long, he was editing short clips and even helping interview participants. Bishop Barron watched the two brothers work side by side, one behind the camera, the other beside it. Redemption was no longer a concept. It was living flesh. At a staff gathering, the bishop took the opportunity to speak about what was happening behind the scenes. "There's a quiet revival happening here," he said, standing in front of his team. "It's not loud, it's not broadcast from rooftops, but it's in the way we look at each other now, in the way we've learned to pause, to ask questions that matter. That's the fruit of presence." He turned toward Thomas and Daniel. "You've shown us that healing isn't just possible. It's contagious." The two brothers looked at each other, smiling. The room echoed with a soft wave of applause, not for fame or success, but for the triumph of restoration. That evening, back at the bishop's home, the three of them sat at the kitchen table. Simple bowls of soup? Warm bread? No agenda? No discussion about work? Just being. Daniel leaned back and said, "You know, I used to think church was just for people who already had their lives together." Bishop Barron smiled. "Most people think that, until they meet Christ." "And where is he?" Daniel asked. "Here," the bishop said, spreading his hands. "In this soup, in this silence, in your story, in your brother's presence." Daniel looked at Thomas, then down at his bowl, then back up. "I think I'm starting to believe that." And Thomas, whose life had once felt like a long string of invisible days, now saw it for what it was, a journey woven by unseen hands, leading him to something far greater than comfort or success. It had led him home. Weeks later, as spring quietly unfolded across Southern California, Bishop Barron walked through the rose garden behind his residence. The air was perfumed with new blossoms, and the hum of bees danced in rhythm with the rustling leaves. It was a rare moment of stillness, and he cherished it. He heard the creak of the old gate and turned to see Thomas and Daniel entering the garden, each holding a small camera bag. Their next trip was coming up, a visit to a Native American reservation in New Mexico to document a community's revival of faith after years of silence. But today, they'd come to talk. "We've been thinking," Thomas said, sitting on a bench under a blossoming jacaranda tree, "about expanding the project." Bishop Barron raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "We want to train others," Daniel said, more confident now than ever. "Teach people how to listen, how to document, how to be present. There's too much pain and too few people willing to witness it." Thomas nodded. "Not just filmmakers, pastors, volunteers, teachers, anyone who interacts with people on the margins." The bishop leaned back, hands folded, impressed. "A school of presence." "Yes," Thomas said. "Mobile workshops, online courses, Real human skills. We've seen how quickly presence spreads when people experience it. We just need to show them how." Bishop Barron smiled, eyes crinkling. "I think the Holy Spirit just gave you your next mission." That afternoon, the three of them sat at the long kitchen table, sketching ideas onto notepads and whiteboards. Daniel came up with the name, the listening table. The concept was simple. Every session would begin with an empty chair and one story. No pressure, no performance, just the sacred space to be heard. The bishop helped gather support from dioceses, donors, and nonprofits. And soon, what began as a YouTube docuseries became a national training program in empathy and accompaniment. The listening table made its debut at a community center in St. Louis, hosted by a local parish that partnered with shelters and outreach workers. The room was filled with people, young, old, well-dressed, rough around the edges, some with wounds visible, others hidden. Thomas opened the session by playing a short film. It was the original footage of himself, silent, sitting on the bench, unaware that Bishop Barron had ever followed him that night. He had spliced in slow shots of the street lamp flickering, the city breathing, the quiet weight of despair. As the video ended, the screen went black. The room remained silent. Then Thomas stepped forward. "That was me," he said. "I didn't know anyone would ever see me. I was certain I had no value left. I had work. I had faith, but I didn't have hope." He paused. Then someone chose to sit beside me instead of walking past. He gestured toward the circle of chairs arranged in the center of the room. "So today, we do the same. We sit, we listen, and we remind people that they matter." People approached the chairs tentatively at first, but one by one they began to open up. A teacher shared about losing a student to suicide. A teenager talked about growing up in a house without love. A veteran admitted he hadn't touched another human being in 5 years. And as they spoke, the room didn't interrupt. It didn't fix. It didn't judge. It just held them. Later that evening, as they packed up, Bishop Barron placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You've turned your pain into a sanctuary." Thomas turned to Daniel, then back to the bishop. "So have you." Their next stop took them to a quiet convent in the hills of Oregon, where a small group of aging nuns had been caring for children with disabilities for decades. The sisters had no social media, no press coverage, and no formal recognition, but their presence had changed hundreds of lives. Sister Agnes, now 87, was nearly blind and used a walker, but her voice was firm as she told the story of one child she'd cared for, a boy who had been abandoned at birth due to severe cerebral palsy. "He couldn't speak, couldn't move much, but when you held his hand, he smiled," she said. "That smile was worth 1,000 sermons." Thomas filmed her face as she said it, weathered, wise, radiant. That night, as they edited the footage in their makeshift studio, Daniel turned to Thomas. "Do you ever feel like we're not capturing enough? Like it's too sacred to hold in a lens?" Thomas looked at the screen for a long moment. "Every time. But that's why we try." More. The episode featuring Sister Agnes became the most viewed in the series to date. It sparked a wave of support for the convent, donations for disability care, and letters of gratitude from parents across the country. But more than that, it reminded people that holiness often lives in hidden places. As summer arrived, the listening table spread to schools, seminaries, diocesan offices, and even correctional facilities. They developed a training kit, a mobile app, and short animations to teach kids how to recognize loneliness in their peers. And at the center of it all was the same message that started on a bench under a street lamp. Presence saves lives. Autumn arrived with crisp mornings and golden leaves blanketing the sidewalks around Los Angeles. The city, often caught in the blur of motion, seemed to breathe slower, softer, like even the streets had paused to listen. Inside Word on Fire's media offices, the atmosphere mirrored the season. It wasn't quiet exactly, but thoughtful, purposeful. Every step, every task, every word had more weight now. One afternoon, as Bishop Barron reviewed the upcoming editorial schedule, his assistant knocked gently on his door. "There's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he said you once changed his life. The bishop raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Send him in." A man stepped into the office, mid-40s, dressed plainly but neatly, eyes kind and tired. He extended his hand. "My name's Luis," he said. "I don't know if you remember me, but about 10 years ago, you visited a prison in Arizona. You gave a talk. It wasn't long, maybe 20 minutes. But at the end, you stayed. You talked with me. You listened." The bishop studied his face, then slowly smiled. "I remember. You were the artist." Luis nodded. "You told me my drawings were a form of prayer. I meant it." "I never forgot that," Luis said, his voice catching. "When I got out, I didn't know where to go, but I remembered your words. I started volunteering at a community center. Now I teach art to kids who've lost parents to violence." Bishop Barron stood and embraced him. Luis stepped back, then pulled a small package from his bag. Inside was a charcoal drawing, a simple image of a bench under a glowing street lamp. "It's called The Turning," he said, "inspired by your story." "By Thomas." The bishop placed the drawing on his desk. His eyes lingered on the strokes, the way the shadows leaned into light, the softness of the bench, the quiet ache in the scene. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Luis smiled. "I just wanted to say thank you for seeing me before I knew how to see myself." After Luis left, the bishop walked the halls with the drawing in hand. He found Thomas and Daniel in the editing room, headphones on, necks bent over glowing monitors. He knocked on the door frame. "Got something for you." They turned, curious. He handed them the drawing. Thomas stared at it in silence. "Is this from someone who said you gave him his voice back?" Daniel leaned closer. "It's us. That bench. That night." The bishop nodded. "But now it's more. It's everyone we've met since, everyone we've listened to." Thomas placed the drawing on the wall beside his desk, not framed, just pinned, bare, honest, like the work they did. That evening, a small ceremony was held at the Word on Fire courtyard. Staff, friends, and collaborators gathered to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of The Invisible Among Us. There were candles, laughter, testimonies, and simple food served from folding tables. Bishop Barron gave a short speech. "A year ago, we started this project thinking we were helping others. But the truth is, we were the ones being healed, one story at a time, one silence at a time." He raised his glass. "To presence, to listening, to grace in the unnoticed." As the night wound down, Thomas found a quiet corner with Daniel. They sat side by side, feet resting on the edge of the fountain, the hum of conversation drifting behind them. "It's strange," Daniel said. "Sometimes I still feel like that kid stuck in the system, like at any moment it'll all fall apart again." Thomas nodded. "Me too. But you know what's different now?" Daniel looked at him. "We're not alone anymore." They sat in silence for a while. Then Daniel said, "You think Mom would have been proud of us?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He watched the water ripple under the moonlight. "I think she'd be proud that we didn't stop believing people could change, even ourselves." Daniel smiled, a slow, quiet thing. "I think you're right." The next day, they were back on the road, this time heading to Appalachia to meet a woman who had started a grief support group in her living room after losing her daughter to an overdose. She had no budget, no degrees, just a worn couch, a tray of tea, and an open door. They arrived in the late afternoon. The home was small, perched on a hill, wine chimes tinkling on the porch. Inside, 6 people sat in a circle, sipping tea and sharing memories of people they loved and lost. Thomas filmed gently, quietly, like holding a newborn. The woman, Lila, spoke near the end. "I used to think my pain would crush me," she said. "But I learned, when you open your pain to others, it doesn't disappear. It becomes a bridge." Later, as they packed up, Lila hugged Thomas tightly. "You remind me of my daughter," she whispered. "She used to listen the way you do." Thomas smiled through the lump in his throat. On the drive back, Daniel was quiet. Finally, he said, "You think we'll ever run out of stories?" Thomas shook his head. "Never. Not while people are still hurting." Bishop Barron, from the front seat, added softly, and not while we still believe that every soul matters." The car fell silent again, not in emptiness, but in peace. They were on the road again, on holy ground. It was near midnight when they returned to Los Angeles. The city lights sparkled below as their plane descended, casting a soft glow over familiar streets. Thomas sat by the window, forehead resting on the cool glass, watching the skyline with a quiet reverence. Every time he came back, it felt different, not like returning to a place, but to a purpose. At baggage claim, Bishop Barron stretched his back and yawned. Daniel fumbled with his phone, arranging a rideshare to take them home. "You two ever get tired of the road?" the bishop asked with a smirk. Thomas grinned. "Only when the coffee's bad," Daniel chuckled. "Only when the hotel showers don't work." They laughed together, tired but content. The next morning, back at Word on Fire, the office was unusually busy. There was a new buzz in the air, and as Thomas entered the building, he was met with warm greetings, pats on the back, and congratulations he hadn't expected. "What's going on?" he asked a staff member. "Haven't you seen the news?" she said, handing him a tablet. On the screen was a headline from a major national publication. "The Church Listens: How a Formerly Homeless Filmmaker is Teaching the World the Power of Presence." Thomas blinked. Below the title was a photo of him and Bishop Barron, taken during one of the listening table workshops. His name was in bold. His story was front and center. He scrolled through the article. It was honest, tender, and respectful. It spoke of his journey from the bench to the camera, from silence to storytelling. It quoted the bishop's reflections on empathy, suffering, and discipleship. It even featured a short interview with Daniel, who said simply, "My brother taught me how to stay. Not run, not fix, just stay." Thomas was overwhelmed. He walked into the chapel and sat down, heart racing, hands shaking. Not from pride, but from humility. How had his life come to this? Not long ago he'd been invisible, and now the world was listening. Later that day, he and the bishop met privately in the garden. "I didn't know they were writing about me," Thomas said quietly. "I didn't either," Bishop Barron replied, "but I'm not surprised. The world is hungry for real stories, and yours is soaked in truth." Thomas looked up. "What if I'm not ready for this kind of attention?" "You don't have to be," the bishop said. "You just have to stay faithful to the work. Let the story keep serving others. Don't let it become about you." Thomas nodded slowly. He knew the bishop was right. That weekend, they held a special retreat at a monastery tucked deep in the Santa Barbara Mountains. It was a gathering of all the people they had interviewed over the past year. Survivors, caregivers, listeners, leaders, all invited to be together, not to speak publicly or be filmed, but just to rest, to be in communion. It was the first time many of them had met each other, and yet there was an immediate bond, a sacred familiarity that went beyond words. They had all shared something profound with the world, and now they shared it with each other. Meals were eaten in silence. Walks were taken beneath the oak trees. Some sat in the chapel for hours, others in rocking chairs on the porch, just watching the wind pass through the hills. One evening, they held a candle-lit vigil in the monastery courtyard. Each person held a small flame. One by one, they named someone they carried in their hearts, a lost loved one, a person who had lifted them, someone they never had the chance to thank. When it was Thomas's turn, he said only, "The boy I used to be," and Daniel beside him whispered, "The brother I almost lost." Bishop Barron, standing before the group, closed the vigil with a simple prayer. "Lord, teach us to listen, not just with our ears, but with our hearts. Let us be present, even when there are no words. And may we always remember that silence is not emptiness, but invitation." The candles flickered. Some wept. Others stood still as stone. But everyone felt the holiness of the moment. When the retreat ended, no one wanted to leave. They lingered at breakfast, hugged long and hard, exchanged numbers and stories and promises to meet again. As they drove down the mountain, Daniel said, "You think we're done telling stories now?" Thomas shook his head. "We're never done. We're just getting quieter." The bishop smiled in the front seat. "That's when the real listening begins." Back in the city, Plans began for the next season of The Invisible Among Us. This time they would go international, visiting refugee camps, forgotten missions, and underground communities of faith. There were voices crying out in every corner of the world, and they would be heard. But before leaving again, they made one more visit, to the bench, the place where it had all begun. They arrived at dusk. The streetlight still flickered. The bench was worn now, its paint chipped, but it stood. Thomas sat down, this time with Daniel beside him and Bishop Barron standing nearby. He closed his eyes. The air was cool. The moment was full. And in the silence, he heard it again. Not a voice, not a sound, but a knowing. You were never forgotten. You were always loved. The next chapter of their journey began with passports, vaccines, and a flurry of international emails. The bishop had received an invitation from a Jesuit mission in Lebanon, working with Syrian refugee families. The mission had heard about the invisible among us and believed it could help the world see what they had been living through for years. Not just displacement and trauma, but resilience, faith, and quiet hope. Thomas and Daniel packed lightly, bringing only what was essential: camera gear, notebooks, and a folder filled with letters from people around the world who had been touched by their work. They flew out with the bishop, hearts open, minds alert. When they landed in Beirut, they were met by Father Elias, a tall, slender man with weathered hands and eyes that had seen too much and still chose to hope. He drove them in silence through winding roads and bustling cityscapes until they reached the edge of the Bekaa Valley, where rows of white tents stretched toward the horizon. "This is where we live," Father Elias said, gesturing out the window. "This is where we stay. Not as visitors, but as brothers." The first story they filmed came from a teenage girl named Amal. She had fled Syria with her family after their village was bombed. Her father had been a school teacher, her mother a nurse. Now they lived in a tent, relying on food donations and the kindness of strangers. But Amal was full of light. "I write poetry," she said, sitting on a mat, her fingers curled around a pencil. "Every morning before the sun rises, it helps me remember who I am." Thomas filmed her as she read one of her poems aloud. Her voice soft but fierce. Her words spoke of trees that still grew in broken soil and of stars that kept shining even when no one looked up. Later, after the cameras were off, Amal turned to Thomas. "Do you think the world will see us now?" He looked her in the eyes. "They will, because your voice is strong." Each day brought more stories. A father rebuilding wheelchairs from scrap metal. A mother teaching girls how to read beneath a tarp held up by sticks. A young boy who prayed every night for peace, though he had never known what it looked like. And as they listened, as they sat in the dirt and drank sweet tea and walked barefoot through the camp, something shifted again in Thomas. He realized he was no longer the one being healed by stories. Now, he was the healer. On their final night in the valley, the mission held a small mass under the stars. There was no chapel, no stained glass, no organ, just a makeshift altar made of wood, a candle flickering in the wind, and the soft hum of Arabic hymns carried on the breeze. Bishop Barron gave a short homily, translated by Father Elias. "We come from a world where stories are sold, edited, packaged. But here we find truth in its purest form, unguarded, undignified, holy. You have reminded us that God speaks loudest in the quietest places." When Mass ended, everyone sat together on the ground. Missionaries, refugees, and visitors alike. Children played. Elders sipped tea. And somewhere in the distance, someone played a flute made from hollow pipe. Daniel leaned over to Thomas. "I don't want to leave." Thomas nodded. "Neither do I." But they knew they had to. Because the story wasn't meant to stay in the valley. It was meant to echo. Back in Los Angeles, the footage they brought home shook the editing team to tears. Even the most seasoned among them said they'd never seen such raw beauty. The colors of the desert, the rhythm of prayer, the fire in Amal's eyes, it all demanded to be felt. They titled the new episode, "Hope Has a Name." When it aired, the response was overwhelming. Donations poured into the mission. Schools across the U.S. began organizing pen pal programs for refugee children. Churches held prayer vigils. and Amal's poem, translated into 20 languages, was read during a UN conference on humanitarian aid. But the greatest response came in the form of a handwritten letter. It was from a 12-year-old boy in Kansas. He wrote, "Dear Amal, I saw your video. I showed it to my class. We all cried. I didn't know someone my age could be so strong. I'm praying for you every night. You're my hero." Thomas read it aloud in the studio. No one spoke for several minutes afterward. The bishop finally broke the silence. She asked if the world would see her. I think it just did. After that, they traveled to Uganda, then to rural towns in Brazil, then to northern India. Each place had its own music, its own wounds, its own sacred way of surviving. But the story remained the same. Presence heals. On a quiet evening between trips, Thomas and Bishop Barron walked through the streets of downtown LA, passing buildings glowing with electric life. A homeless man sat near the edge of the sidewalk, cradling a small dog. Thomas knelt down and offered him a sandwich from his bag. The man smiled. "Bless you." Thomas looked at him. "And you." As they walked on, the bishop said softly, "Do you see it?" "See what?" "You're the one sitting beside others now. The circle's complete." Thomas breathed deeply, feeling the cool night air in his lungs. "No," he said. "The circle's just beginning." Winter settled in quietly that year. Though Los Angeles didn't carry snow, the city took on a stillness that made the season felt. Cooler nights, slower walks, lights flickering in windows. At Word on Fire, the team prepared for a new project that would take their message even deeper. It was Daniel's idea this time. "We should create a film," he said one morning during a staff meeting. "Not just a docuseries, a full-length feature, something that tells one story all the way through. One that represents everything we've seen, everything we've learned." Bishop Barron leaned forward. "Whose story?" Thomas looked down, hands folded. "I think it should be mine." The room was quiet. "I don't mean that out of pride," Thomas said quickly, "but because I've come to understand something. My story, it's not just mine. It belongs to every person who's ever felt unseen, unheard, unloved, and maybe if they see it from start to finish, they'll realize they're not alone." The bishop nodded, deeply moved. "I agree. It's time." The planning began. The script was written, based on Thomas's journey from childhood through foster care, homelessness, rediscovery, and healing. But the film would also weave in elements of the stories they had encountered along the way. Amal's poem, Sister Agnes's rocking chair, the man at the prison, the bench. They titled it The Bench. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic, but it was true. The production took 5 months. Scenes were shot across multiple cities: Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Santa Barbara. They reenacted the bench moment with an actor portraying Thomas and another playing the bishop. Daniel worked as co-director, pouring himself into every frame. There were moments when it became too personal, too raw. During one scene, filming the eviction reenactment, Thomas had to leave the set. "I didn't think it would hit me like that," he told the bishop later, standing outside beneath a tree. "That's because you're still healing," the bishop replied. "And that's okay." By spring, the film was complete. They didn't plan a big Hollywood premiere. Instead, they hosted a screening in the church, where Thomas had once sat in the back pews, hidden and hollow. This time, he stood in the front row, hand in hand with Daniel. The church was packed. Staff, volunteers, people from shelters, former inmates, clergy, youth, old friends, strangers who had followed their work. Bishop Barron introduced the film. "This is not just a story of suffering. It is a story of being seen, a story of presence, and most of all, a story of grace." The lights dimmed. The screen lit up. For the next 90 minutes, the room was silent, breathless. The audience journeyed through Thomas's pain, his wandering, the night on the bench, the hand on his shoulder. They watched his rise, his healing, his mission. And at the end, the final scene showed Thomas, older, calm, sitting beside someone else on a bench, offering a sandwich, and simply staying. When the credits rolled, no one moved. Then a single clap, then another, and suddenly, the room erupted. Not in noise, but in standing silence. People rose to their feet and simply stood there, eyes wet, hearts full. Thomas stood too, tears streaming freely now. Daniel hugged him hard. Bishop Barron placed a hand on his back. "You did it," the bishop whispered. "And now it belongs to the world." The film sparked something none of them expected. Community centers began hosting screenings. Schools used it in classes about empathy and social justice. Parishes held Lenten viewings followed by listening table workshops. The bench in the final scene became a symbol. Quiet, enduring, sacred. Letters poured in. A pastor from Ireland wrote, "I've restructured my entire ministry after watching your film." A high school student from the Philippines said, "I didn't know priests could cry. Now I believe they care." A former addict from Detroit shared, "After 20 years I forgave my father, because I saw you forgive the world." One letter arrived from a nurse in a hospice care unit. "I keep the film playing softly at night for our patients. They sleep better when it's on." Thomas read each letter slowly, carefully. He kept them all in a shoebox beside his bed. He never let himself forget. This wasn't about fame. It was about fidelity, faithfulness to a story bigger than him. Months later, while walking alone through a quiet park, Thomas passed a real bench, empty, under an old lamppost. He sat just for a minute, letting the moment wash over him. A woman walked by, saw him sitting, and paused. "Are you—" He looked up and smiled. "I am." She sat down beside him, wordless. After a while she said, "My son took his life 2 years ago. I haven't sat on a bench since. I didn't think I could." He looked at her gently. "Thank you for sitting here." They didn't speak after that. They didn't have to. Some benches were for resting, others were for remembering, but the most sacred were for witnessing. The seasons changed once more. Summer rolled in, bringing with it long days, soft evenings, and a new energy to the city. But something inside Thomas had settled into stillness, a peace that didn't come from having all the answers, but from finally being at home in his own story. One quiet Saturday morning, he met Bishop Barron and Daniel at a small coffee shop near the edge of downtown. It had become their unofficial meeting place, a neutral ground where titles and roles melted into conversation. Thomas stirred his drink and looked up. "I've been thinking about starting something new." The bishop raised his brow. "Another film?" "No, something simpler. A physical space." Daniel leaned in. "Like an office?" "No," Thomas said, his voice low and warm. "A place for people to come and just be. No agenda, no preaching. Just a space with benches, tea, silence, maybe some music playing quietly, and someone always there to listen." Bishop Barron smiled slowly, recognizing the spirit at work. "A sanctuary of presence," Thomas nodded. "Exactly, for anyone who's felt invisible. A place where you don't need to explain your sadness to be welcomed." They called it the Quiet Room. The vision was clear from the start. It would be located in the heart of the city, open 7 days a week, staffed by trained volunteers, many of whom had been through listening table workshops. No one would wear uniforms or name tags. There would be no check-in, no sign-up list. Just a sign on the door that read, "Come in, sit down, be seen." The space was donated by a local parish that had closed its former gift shop. Volunteers painted the walls a soft beige. Daniel installed low lighting and soft speakers in the corners. Thomas brought in second-hand chairs, cushions, and, of course, a wooden bench, right under a gently glowing lamp. Word spread quietly at first, through whisper, prayer, and the natural magnetism of need. But within the first week, people began to come. A college student overwhelmed by anxiety, a mother who'd lost a child, a priest on the brink of burnout, a man who hadn't spoken to another soul in days. They entered without fanfare, sat in silence, sometimes cried, sometimes just stared. And always someone sat near them, not close enough to intrude, just close enough to say, "I'm here." One night, Thomas arrived late, long after closing time, but the door had been left unlocked by accident. Inside, he found a teenage boy asleep on the bench, a backpack curled beneath his head. Thomas didn't wake him. He covered him with a light blanket, dimmed the lights, and sat nearby until sunrise. When the boy awoke, he looked startled, then scared. "It's okay," Thomas said softly. "You're safe." The boy nodded, blinking back tears. "I didn't know where else to go." "You came to the right place," Thomas replied. The boy's name was Elijah. He had run away from an abusive home 2 states away. No one had noticed. No one had looked for him. But someone had left the door open. Elijah became the first resident of a new idea born that morning. The upper room, a quiet shelter connected to the quiet room, offering temporary housing for young people in crisis. Bishop Barron helped secure the necessary permits, and Daniel coordinated with local outreach teams. They found a space above the sanctuary and filled it with bunk beds, books, and warmth. Elijah stayed there for 6 months. He finished his GED. He got a part-time job. He started playing music again, an old acoustic guitar Thomas found at a thrift shop. One night, Elijah played during an open evening at the quiet room. His voice was shaky at first, then grew strong. His song didn't have perfect melody or polished lyrics, but it had truth. After he finished, no one clapped. They just sat in reverent silence. Later, Elijah told Thomas, "You gave me back the part of myself I thought I'd never see again." Thomas answered, "You did that yourself. We just gave you a bench to start from." More upper rooms followed, one in Chicago, one in Dallas, one in rural Georgia, inside an old barn-turned chapel, and each one bore the same inscription carved into wood above the entrance: "To be present is to love." The media stopped calling after a while. The articles faded. The film slowly drifted from the spotlight. But Thomas didn't mind. He preferred it that way. Because the work had never been about attention. It had always been about presence. He still filmed, he still edited, but now his camera focused on smaller things. A girl helping her grandmother walk. A man planting flowers beside a rundown building. A child laughing in the arms of a foster father. Tiny stories, eternal echoes, and Bishop Barron. He continued his ministry with renewed depth. His sermons took on a gentler cadence. His eyes noticed more. He spoke less of proving doctrine and more of embodying it. He preached presence, not as a method, but as a way of life. In a podcast one afternoon, he said, "There was a time I thought evangelization meant speaking louder. Now I know sometimes it means sitting quietly, listening, and leaving space for God to speak first." The host asked him what had changed. He smiled. "I followed someone once, a young man who walked into the shadows. I didn't save him. I just walked behind him until he knew he wasn't alone. And in that journey, I found my own healing." Years passed. The quiet room became more than a space. It became a movement. Cities began requesting guidance to start their own. Churches adapted their side chapels. Libraries created listening corners. Even hospitals began incorporating the model. One room, one bench, one presence. Thomas never trademarked the concept. He didn't build a brand. He simply gave it away. When asked by a reporter why he never monetized the movement, he answered, "Because presence should never cost anything." By then, Thomas had grown into his 40s. His face had lines now, soft ones around the eyes from years of listening, smiling, weeping with others. His beard had flecks of gray. He still filmed, but more often he trained others. And every Sunday afternoon, without fail, he returned to the original bench, the one under the flickering street lamp. He never said much there, just sat. Sometimes people joined him, sometimes they didn't. Once a woman came and sat beside him for 20 minutes, sobbing softly into her scarf. He never asked why. When she left, she simply said, "Thank you," and he nodded. He didn't need to know the details. He trusted that God had been present. Bishop Barron continued to lead and serve, now revered as one of the most quietly influential voices in the church. He had become a mentor to many, not just in faith, but in the art of noticing. His teachings had shifted entirely. Less apologetics, more accompaniment. One spring morning, he invited Thomas to lunch at his home. They sat on the patio beneath a canopy of vines, sunlight dancing through the leaves. The bishop poured 2 glasses of iced tea and looked across the table with a strange expression. "I have something I want to ask you," he said. Thomas waited. "I'd like you to speak at the next synod gathering in Rome." Thomas blinked. "Me? Why?" "Because they need to hear from someone who's actually done the work, someone who didn't study presence in books but lived it on a bench." Thomas looked down. "I'm not a theologian." "You're more than that," the bishop said. "You're a witness." After some silence, Thomas agreed. A few months later, he stood in a grand marble hall beneath gold ceilings, surrounded by cardinals, bishops, priests, and lay leaders from around the world. His hands shook as he adjusted the microphone. Then he told the story. The bench, the silence, the night he thought he was forgotten, and the voice that broke through all of it. Not with answers, but with presence. He didn't speak long, just enough. And when he finished, there was no clapping. Only the same silence he had come to know so well. Holy, heavy, alive. Pope Francis was there that day. After the session, he approached Thomas quietly, took his hands in his own, and said in English, "You have done what the church must do. You have stayed." Thomas didn't know what to say, so he simply bowed. After Rome, the invitations poured in, but Thomas declined most of them, not out of pride, but out of clarity. He returned home, resumed his walks, his filming, his evenings at the quiet room. He knew the world didn't need more noise. It needed more listening. One day, years later, Daniel approached him on a slow afternoon at the center. "You ever think about writing it down?" he asked. "All of it?" Thomas looked at him. "I think the stories have already been written." Daniel grinned. "But not yours." Thomas considered it. Then, over the course of a year, he began writing. Not a memoir, not a theological essay, but a collection of small reflections. 1 page each, no chapters, just glimpses, moments, pauses. He titled the book, "The Space Between Words." When it was published, it wasn't pushed into stores. It quietly appeared online, and slowly, organically, it spread. People began reading it in staff meetings, prisons, classrooms, and even recovery circles. One line became especially well known. "Don't underestimate what happens when you sit beside someone and say nothing." That line ended up on bookmarks, on posters, on coffee mugs, but Thomas never saw them as his. They belonged to the silence. One winter evening, as rain tapped gently on the windows, Bishop Barron, now retired from public ministry, visited the quiet room. His hair had gone fully white, and he walked with a cane, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He sat beside Thomas on the bench by the door, the same one where Elijah had once slept. "I think," the bishop said slowly, "this is the holiest place I've ever been." Thomas smiled. "Because of the silence?" "No," he answered. "Because of the listening." They sat together in the hush, the rain forming soft rhythms on the roof. And somewhere outside, in the dark corners of the city, someone was walking toward the light, toward a bench, toward presence. Years slipped by like pages turning in a book, each one quiet, sacred, and full. Thomas never chased recognition. He no longer needed to. His life had become a living story, a slow unfolding of presence, grace, and sacred interruption. On his 50th birthday, the staff at the Quiet Room surprised him with a simple celebration. No balloons, no streamers, just a potluck dinner, soft music playing, and dozens of handwritten letters left in a basket near his seat. Each letter began the same way. "Because you listened." Thomas read them slowly. One from a teacher who had found the courage to leave an abusive marriage. One from a former inmate now mentoring at-risk youth. One from a young woman who said she was alive because someone met her at the bench on her darkest night. Later that evening, after everyone had gone, Thomas remained behind, sitting in the dimmed light. Daniel came in carrying 2 cups of tea. 50, Daniel said, handing one to him. "How does it feel?" Thomas chuckled. "Feels like 25, but my knees disagree." They sipped quietly. Then Daniel said, "You should know something. There's a boy who came in last week. He's 14. Barely said a word. Just sat on the bench, staring at the floor. I tried to talk to him, but he didn't respond." Thomas looked at him with interest. But when he saw your name on the plaque by the door, he whispered, "That's the guy from the movie." And then he said, "If he made it, maybe I can too." Thomas didn't reply. He just looked out the window, eyes brimming. Sometimes presence echoed louder than words ever could. Later that year, the Quiet Room in Los Angeles reached its 10-year anniversary. What started as one bench in one city had now become a network of over 300 locations around the world. From small towns in Canada to refugee shelters in Europe. From school libraries in South Africa to retirement homes in Japan. Each one followed the same pattern. No agenda, no pressure, just presence. To mark the anniversary, Bishop Barron, now living quietly in a coastal town, was invited to give a closing reflection at the global livestream event. Though frail, he accepted. His voice was slower, but his conviction burned bright. He sat before the camera in a simple chair, wearing a soft cardigan instead of his formal robes. Behind him, the ocean waves rolled gently under a cloudy sky. "There's a parable Jesus never told," he began. "But maybe he lived it." He smiled faintly, pausing. "It goes like this. A shepherd saw one of his sheep disappear, not with noise, not with drama, but quietly. The sheep didn't cry out. It simply walked off into the night. And the shepherd, rather than shouting, rather than chasing, simply followed. Slowly, silently, with love." The bishop looked directly into the camera. "I believe we live in a time when the church must learn to follow again. Not with power, but with presence. Not with urgency, but with patience. If we can sit with the suffering, we will find Christ again." That was his last public appearance. He passed away peacefully in his sleep 6 months later. Thomas was one of the first to be notified. The news hit him like a quiet wave, not devastating but deep, like the tide pulling at something embedded in the soul. He didn't cry immediately. He simply sat on the bench outside the Quiet Room, held the bishop's old rosary in his hand, and listened to the wind. The funeral was held at the cathedral in Los Angeles, attended by thousands. But Thomas didn't sit in the front pews with dignitaries and clergy. He stood in the back, quiet, still, present. After the ceremony, as people gathered for formal speeches, Thomas slipped away. He went to the bench, the original one. The streetlight above it had been replaced with a new lamp, but the spot still looked the same. He sat down and whispered, "Thank you." Then he pulled a small wooden cross from his pocket, the same one the bishop had once given him years ago. He placed it on the bench. "I'll take it from here," he said softly. From that day forward, Thomas visited the bench not as a memory, but as a mission. He began to write again, not for books or articles, but as letters. Letters addressed to the people he'd never meet, the hurting, the wandering, the ones whose stories had never been told. He titled the series, Letters from the Bench. They were published anonymously, shared across the world. Each one spoke into the silence of grief, depression, fear, loneliness. No advice, no answers, just presence in words. "I don't know your pain, but I know it matters. You are not alone, even when the room is empty. You are seen, even when you are silent." These letters found their way into waiting rooms, into shelters, into school desks, into prisons, and somehow, into hearts. Years later, a young woman came into the Quiet Room holding one of those letters. It was folded, creased from rereading. She didn't speak. She simply held it out to Thomas, tears in her eyes, and pointed at the final line. It read, "When you're ready to be seen, I'll be waiting, on the bench." And without a word, she sat down beside him. The bench had long since become more than just wood and bolts. It had become sacred ground. People from around the world visited it, not as tourists, but as pilgrims. Some knelt before it. Others sat in reverent silence. Some left flowers. Others left letters, but most came simply to be still. Thomas never advertised it. He never called it holy, but it had become in many ways the physical manifestation of what the bishop had always taught. Presence is the first act of love. One morning, Thomas arrived early to the Quiet Room. The city was just waking up, the sun rising behind the haze of the skyline. When he entered, he found a young man already sitting on the bench. He looked about 20, with tired eyes and trembling hands. Thomas didn't ask any questions. He sat down a few feet away, hands resting in his lap. Minutes passed. Finally, the young man spoke. I almost didn't come in. Thomas looked at him gently. But you did. The young man nodded. I've been living in my car. Lost my job last month. My family doesn't know. I don't know what to do anymore. Thomas didn't offer solutions. He just said, I've been there. The young man turned slowly. You have? Thomas nodded. This very bench. Many years ago. Silence again. Then the young man said, How did you survive? Thomas looked out the window, watching the morning light filter through the trees. Someone followed me, and then sat beside me. That's where it began. The young man began to cry, not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears, released in the safety of being seen. Thomas sat with him for over an hour. When the young man stood to leave, he turned and asked, Do you think I could come back tomorrow? Thomas smiled. That's why we're here. After he left, Thomas stood and looked around the room. The light, the hush, the old bench. He thought of Bishop Barron, of Amal, of Daniel, of Sister Agnes and Elijah, and the dozens of others who had given shape to his life through simple, brave honesty. He walked to the back of the room where a small wooden shelf stood beside a candle. On it were journals, blank ones for anyone who wished to write. Some were full, others just held a line or two. Thomas opened one and read a single sentence. I came here broken. I left here breathing. He closed the journal and lit the candle. Then he whispered, Thank you. That evening, he and Daniel walked the streets together. They did that often now. No plans, no cameras. Just wandering. Sometimes they found people who needed help. Sometimes they were the ones who needed it. As they crossed a quiet intersection, Daniel asked, Do you ever think about what would have happened if the bishop hadn't followed you? Thomas thought for a moment, then nodded. I do. And? I think I wouldn't have made it. Daniel didn't reply. He just reached over and placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. Then I'm glad he did. The night was calm. A breeze swept through the palm trees, and the sound of distant traffic hummed like a lullaby. They stopped by the original bench again. No one was there this time. Just the glow of the street lamp and the quiet hum of grace. Thomas sat down, Daniel beside him. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. The next day, a letter arrived in the mail, addressed to the man on the bench. There was no return address, just a folded page. Inside was a short note. You don't know me. But 5 years ago, I was about to end my life. I walked past your bench. You looked up and smiled. Just that. I kept walking, but I couldn't forget it. That smile saved me. Thank you. Thomas read it 3 times. Then he placed it in the shoebox, alongside hundreds of other letters. Each one a ripple from one quiet night. One decision to follow. One sacred pause. That weekend, Thomas gave a short talk at a youth retreat. He didn't bring slides. No notes. Just a single object. A small, wooden bench model he carved by hand. He placed it on the podium and said, This is where God found me. And it's where I've spent every day since. Learning to stay, learning to listen. He looked out at the faces of teenagers, wide-eyed and uncertain. Then he smiled. If you don't know what to do with your life, find a bench. Sit with someone. Be present. That's where love begins. Afterward, a girl came up holding her phone. Can I take a picture of the bench? Thomas handed it to her. No, he said. Take a picture with it. She laughed. Okay. As he took the photo, he saw her smile, really smile. It reminded him of Amal, of hope. That night, back at home, he opened his journal and wrote one sentence. Presence is the miracle that no one sees coming. Then he closed the book and whispered a quiet prayer. The rhythm of Thomas's life became one of quiet faithfulness, showing up every day, sitting on the bench, answering letters, listening to strangers who entered the quiet room with silent pain in their eyes. He never called himself a counselor or a minister, but to those who came, he was more than either. He was a witness, a companion, a mirror of their worth. One evening, just before closing time, the door creaked open, and a woman stepped inside. She was in her late 60s, with silver hair tied back and hands that trembled slightly as she held a worn photograph. She walked over to the bench, looked at Thomas and said, "May I?" He nodded. She sat down, placing the photo gently on her lap. "This is my son," she said. "He died in the military 15 years ago. I still feel him everywhere, but some days it's too quiet." Thomas glanced at the photograph. A young man in uniform, bright-eyed, smiling. "I'm sorry," he said softly. She nodded. "I come here every year on this day, his birthday. I just need a place where I don't have to be okay." Thomas didn't speak. He just sat with her, breathing alongside her pain. After a while she whispered, "Do you believe he knows I'm still loving him?" Thomas turned toward her, his voice tender. "I believe love like that echoes through eternity." Tears spilled down her cheeks. She smiled. "I think so too." She stayed until closing, then stood, carefully folding the photo and placing it in her coat pocket. "Thank you," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "for keeping this space alive." Thomas watched her leave, the door closing gently behind her. He sat for a long while afterward, heart full. Later that night he wrote in his journal, "Sometimes we don't need to give people answers. We just need to give them a chair beside our soul." That winter, Daniel took a sabbatical to spend time with his wife and newborn daughter. He sent Thomas pictures almost daily, tiny hands, big yawns, sleepy smiles. Each one reminded Thomas how life keeps beginning again. One photo in particular caught his heart. Daniel sitting on a bench in the park, baby nestled in his arms, both of them bathed in afternoon sunlight. Thomas smiled when he saw it. The legacy was continuing. During those months alone, Thomas returned to something he hadn't done in years. He began filming again. Not big stories, just moments. Small windows into presence. A man feeding pigeons in silence. A child holding her grandmother's hand across a cafe table. A stranger wrapping a scarf around a homeless man's shoulders. He called the project Sacred Ordinary. He uploaded one short film each week, no narration, no music, just life, unfiltered. The response was quiet but deep. Comments began to fill the page. "I watched this after a panic attack. It helped me breathe. My mother has dementia. This reminded me she's still here. I haven't said anything all day, but this made me feel heard." The project gained no media attention, no awards, but Thomas felt more connected to his purpose than ever. One day, he received a letter postmarked from a remote village in northern Alaska. It read, "We watch your Sacred Ordinary videos every Friday night at the community hall. Most of us don't speak English well, but your silence speaks for us. Thank you." Thomas placed the letter in the shoebox. It was getting full now. He didn't mind. He had started a second one anyway. Spring arrived, and with it, an idea began to stir in Thomas's heart. It came not as a vision or a thunderous calling, but as a quiet knowing, like something that had been growing inside him for years was finally blooming. He walked to the original bench one morning, journal in hand, and sat in the rising light. He wrote 3 words on the page: "It's time now." That evening, he shared the thought with Daniel, who had just returned from his sabbatical. "I think I'm ready to pass it on." Daniel tilted his head. "Pass what?" "The quiet room, the bench, the letters, everything." Daniel sat down beside him, processing. "You're not quitting, are you?" Thomas shook his head. "No, just shifting. I think it's time to let others lead." Daniel looked at him carefully. "You sure?" "I am. I want to spend more time in the stillness, in prayer, in listening not to others, but to God." Daniel nodded slowly. "So, what will you do?" Thomas smiled. "I'm going to build a bench. In the woods, by the river. And I'm going to sit, maybe write, maybe pray, maybe just watch the wind move through the trees." Daniel laughed softly. "Sounds like heaven." Thomas looked into the distance. "I think it will be." They hugged that night. Brothers not just by blood, but by grace. Thomas promised to remain close, to return whenever he was needed. But his season of carrying the bench in the public square had come to a close. He was ready to become the quiet presence behind the movement. The next week, the Quiet Room hosted a transition gathering. Thomas didn't make a speech. He simply placed the shoebox of letters on the center table and said, "These are the stories that built this place. Let them lead you now." Then he sat down, in the back, just listening. The forest where Thomas chose to build his bench was about 2 hours north of Los Angeles, tucked deep in the mountains near a slow-moving river. The land belonged to an old monastery that had long been closed, its grounds reclaimed by silence, trees, and time. Through a mutual friend, Thomas received permission to live in one of the small stone cottages on the edge of the property. He brought very little with him, just a few clothes, his camera, his journals, a Bible, and a small wooden cross that had once belonged to Bishop Barron. The bench he built himself, over the course of 3 days. He selected a spot near the water, beneath a canopy of tall pines where birds nested high above and the wind rustled softly through the leaves. The bench was simple. 2 wooden planks, smooth and sanded, held steady by sturdy legs rooted deep into the earth. He didn't mark it, no plaque, no inscription. It didn't need one. Its presence was its own invitation. Each morning, Thomas would walk to the bench with a thermos of coffee and his journal. He'd sit, listen to the birds, watch the river glide past, and write down whatever stirred in his heart. Some days, it was nothing, just a sentence. Other days, pages poured out of him like a prayer. He called the new journal Whispers by the Water. He didn't publish these writings. He didn't record them. They were between him and God. Word slowly spread that Thomas had retreated into the mountains. Some people came looking for him, curious, hoping for wisdom. But he rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when he did, his words were few and careful, like stones placed gently in a riverbed. One day, a young seminarian found him sitting at the bench. He approached nervously, unsure of what to say. "Are you Thomas?" Thomas turned, nodded, and gestured for him to sit. They sat in silence for nearly 30 minutes. Then the young man whispered, "I think I'm losing my faith." Thomas didn't react. He didn't correct. He just asked, "What does it feel like?" The young man sighed, "Like I'm screaming underwater, and no one hears me." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's what silence felt like for me too." They said nothing more for a long time. Eventually the young man stood. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not trying to fix me." Thomas smiled. "I'm not here to fix anyone, just to be with them in the water." The seminarian left that day with no answers, but with something better, a sense that maybe, just maybe, his silence wasn't empty after all. More visitors came, not many, and not often, but enough. Each one left with something, a word, a pause, a sense of being heard. Thomas began carving small wooden tokens in the evenings, pieces of cedar shaped like river stones, each with a single word etched into them. Still, breathe, seen, wait, hope. He left them on the bench for people to find. They always disappeared. He never made more than a few at a time. He didn't want the bench to become a destination. He wanted it to remain what it had always been, a meeting place between pain and peace. One day in early autumn, he received a letter by hand. It was from Daniel. It simply read, "I miss the way you listen." So Thomas packed a bag, left a note for the monastery caretakers, and traveled back to Los Angeles for a few days. When he walked into the quiet room, the staff looked up in surprise. Then joy, no announcement, no fuss, just Thomas. He sat on the bench. Soon people began to come in. One woman brought a letter she'd written but never sent. A man carried his mother's rosary. A teenager brought a photograph of a pet he had lost. No one asked Thomas to speak. He didn't. He just stayed. That evening, Daniel and Thomas walked the streets once more like they used to. The city had changed, but not their rhythm. At one point, Daniel stopped and said, "It's different without you." Thomas looked up at the streetlights. "It was never about me." Daniel smiled. That's why it worked. Before returning to the forest, Thomas visited the original bench one last time. Someone had added flowers. A candle burned low. A small card was taped beneath the seat. "This is where I found God again." Thomas touched the card, then sat. The city moved around him, but the moment was still. And in the stillness, he whispered again, "Thank you." Then he stood, turned, and walked into the night, not as a leader, not as a voice, but as a presence. Just as he had always been. Back in the forest, the rhythm resumed. The days grew shorter, the wind a little colder. Leaves fell like soft prayers onto the earth, and the river moved slower beneath the weight of the coming winter. Thomas welcomed the change. He had always loved transitions, the way the world surrendered to what comes next without fear, without resistance. One morning, as he approached the bench, he noticed something new: a bundle of dried wildflowers tied with twine, resting on the seat. No note, no name, just beauty, left behind by someone who had come and been changed. He sat down beside it, careful not to disturb the offering. For a while he simply breathed. Later that week, a letter arrived at the cottage. It was handwritten, addressed in careful script. Inside was a message from a woman named Claire. "I found your bench a few weeks ago. I didn't know why I was there, only that I needed to be. I had just lost my sister. I hadn't spoken a word to anyone in 3 days. But that morning, the wind through the trees sounded like her laughter, and I remembered that silence doesn't mean she's gone. It just means I have to listen differently now. Thank you." Thomas folded the letter and placed it in a drawer next to his Bible. That night, by the fire, he whispered a name he'd never known before, Claire's sister, and asked God to hold her. Even in solitude, Thomas remained a vessel. Every knock on the cottage door, every step on the trail, every stranger who came and sat beside the river brought with them a new page in the ever-expanding story of grace. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hills, Thomas heard footsteps on the path. A man in his 70s appeared, wearing a simple jacket and holding a cane. He introduced himself with a smile. "My name's Malcolm. I read about you once, years ago. I never came. Didn't think I needed to." Thomas offered him a seat. They sat. After a while, Malcolm continued, "But then my wife passed, and I found myself carrying all these words with no place to put them." Thomas nodded. "You can put them here." Malcolm took a breath and began to talk, not dramatically, not in a rush, but like someone slowly unpacking a full suitcase. He spoke of their first date, her laugh, her fight with cancer, her final prayer. And when he finished, he looked at Thomas with moist eyes and said, "Thank you for not interrupting." Thomas smiled. That's what benches are for. After Malcolm left, Thomas stayed a while longer. The moon rose above the trees, casting silver light across the ground. Somewhere in the branches, an owl called softly. In his journal that night, Thomas wrote, "If I do nothing else for the rest of my life, this will be enough." But life had one more whisper for him. Months later, a woman knocked on the door of the cottage carrying a child, no older than 5, with big eyes and a nervous grip on her hand. She introduced herself as Mira. The child's name was Sam. They had no place to go. Mira had heard about the bench from someone in a recovery group in the city. She didn't know what she expected, only that her spirit told her, "Go." Thomas welcomed them in. No questions, just tea, warmth, silence. They stayed for 3 days. On the second day, Sam asked Thomas if he had ever been afraid. Thomas smiled gently. "Many times." "What did you do?" "I listened to the fear, and then I let God answer it." Sam didn't say anything in return, but he sat closer after that. On the morning they left, Mira took Thomas's hand. "I don't know how to repay you." "You already have," he said. "How?" "You gave me a reason to stay." She looked at him, understanding dawning behind her tired eyes. "Presence saves both sides, doesn't it?" Thomas nodded. "Always." After they left, he walked to the bench. He sat for a long time that morning, looking at the ripples in the water, the trees reaching upward, the clouds passing without hurry. He closed his eyes and simply said, "Amen." And the world, in its own way, answered. Years later, no one really remembered exactly when the bench in the forest became legend. There was no formal dedication, no signpost, no road leading directly to it. But somehow people kept finding it. They arrived with heavy hearts and weary steps. Some brought letters, others brought nothing but silence. But every person who found that bench left different than they came. They said there was a man who lived nearby. Kind eyes, quiet voice. Wouldn't say much, but somehow knew what to say without words. Some never saw him at all, but they said they felt something when they sat, like they were being heard, even in their silence. like someone had left space there just for them. Thomas never stopped showing up, even when his hands grew slower and his hair turned white, even when his legs ached in the cold, even when the world around him moved on to newer things. He sat and listened and loved. Then one morning, he didn't come to the bench. The sun rose the same, the river flowed the same, the trees whispered their familiar songs. But the bench sat empty. The caretakers found him peacefully in bed, journal on his chest, pen still in hand. He had been writing. His last page said only, "Presence is the prayer we forget to pray." His passing was not met with headlines or breaking news, but word spread in the way sacred things do, quietly, heart to heart, soul to soul. Letters poured into the quiet room, one from a woman in Ireland. I never met him, but his silence healed a wound I didn't know I had. Another from a prisoner in Michigan. He gave me permission to be seen without shame. A third, from a little boy in Japan who had seen a video of the forest bench. I hope he is sitting on a cloud now, next to Jesus. Daniel, older now with gray in his beard and wisdom in his voice, returned to the bench 1 week after Thomas's death. He brought a candle, a journal, and silence. He sat where his brother once did. He placed his hand on the wood, now smooth from years of presence. He whispered, "You stayed until the end, and I'll stay too." And so he did. Daniel began visiting the bench regularly, sometimes just to sit, sometimes to guide those who came searching. He didn't try to become Thomas. He just kept the silence alive. And others came too, those who had once been healed by the presence of the bench, returning now to hold space for others. The movement continued, but not in the way movements often do, not with banners or branding. It continued in every person who sat quietly with a friend, in every teacher who paused before speaking, every nurse who held a patient's hand without rush, every priest who let the silence stretch just a little longer before the Amen. Years later, a small plaque was placed beside the bench, not by a foundation, but by someone anonymous. It read, "This is where a man sat, and by sitting, he taught us how to love." Visitors still come. They sit, they breathe, they remember. Some don't know the story. They just feel something sacred there, and every once in a while, someone leaves behind a wooden token, carved with a word, still, hope, wait, seen. And in the hush of the forest, the wind carries an echo, not loud, but steady. The same echo that followed a bishop through city streets all those years ago. The same one that found a young man on a bench, trembling in shame. The echo of grace, the sound of presence, the whisper of God, still here, still listening. And so, in the end, what began with a silent decision, a bishop choosing to follow a quiet, unnoticed employee, unfolded into a story that reached thousands, maybe millions, but numbers were never the point. The point was presence, not dramatic speeches, not great fame, just a simple moment on a bench, under a flickering streetlight, where someone who felt invisible was finally seen. Bishop Robert Barron didn't rescue Thomas. He didn't fix him. He didn't preach at him. He sat beside him. And that moment, so small, so easy to miss, became a turning point that neither of them could have predicted, because Thomas went on to become a light for others, not because he became perfect, but because he allowed his wounds to become windows. And in doing so, he reminded the world of something we so easily forget, that we are not called to be saviors. We are called to be present, to sit with the hurting, to notice the silent, to walk beside the weary, to stay, even when it's uncomfortable. Thomas built benches all over the world, not always physical ones. Sometimes they were films, or letters, or rooms filled with nothing but listening hearts. And every one of those benches whispered the same truth: you matter. Even if you're broken, even if you're lost, even if no one sees you yet, God does. In the quiet of a forest, with a journal on his chest and peace on his face, Thomas slipped from this life into the arms of the one he had served in silence. No grand exit, just stillness and love. And now, it's our turn. Because somewhere, someone is sitting on a bench, wondering if anyone will come. wondering if their pain is too much, wondering if they are too far gone. Maybe we're not meant to have the answers. Maybe we're just meant to show up, to sit, to listen, to love. If this story touched your heart, then don't let it end here. Let it become your story, your bench, your presence. Because sometimes the smallest act of grace, one quiet decision to stay, can echo into eternity.